Leanne Tiernan, a 16-year-old schoolgirl, disappeared at around 5 p.m. on Sunday, November 26, 2000, while walking alone through an isolated and unlit path known as Houghley Gill, less than a mile from where she lived in Bramley, Leeds. She took the public footpath as a shortcut home after going Christmas shopping with a friend. The two friends said their goodbyes and Leanne was never seen again. The search for her became the largest West Yorkshire had ever seen. More than 1,000 properties were searched, a 3-mile stretch of canal was drained, and rubbish collections were halted while police looked for any sign of her. Leanne's family made public appeals, and police released an e-fit of a man seen walking a small dog in the area. The man was not a regular dog walker in the area, but had been seen several times near where Leanne went missing before her disappearance. But not after. 8 months later, Leanne's body was found in Lindley Woods in North Yorkshire by a local walker. Police launched a major murder investigation. Leanne had been strangled, and it was now becoming apparent that she had been abducted. Leanne's body provided clues about who had killed her, but hopes of a quick breakthrough were dashed when tests revealed there was none of the murderer's DNA on the body. This was a real disappointment, but the police began a different approach. Piecing together a jigsaw of evidence obtained through tenacious policing that ensured no stone was left unturned. First, they publicly appealed to people linked to the Bramley area of Leeds and Lindley Woods. Experience told police the murderer was likely to have been familiar with both the location where Leanne had been abducted and where her body had been left. The appeal generated hundreds of names, including the name of a poacher who lived in Bramley and used to go to the woods, John Taylor. Secondly, detectives set out to investigate the items found on Leanne. Leanne's body was discovered wrapped in a duvet cover and green dustbin liners. Her head was covered by a black plastic bag held in place by a dog collar. A scarf and plastic cable tie had been tied around her neck, and cable ties were bound together with her wrists. Police went to great lengths to trace people in Bramley who had bought a dog collar matching the one found on Leanne's body. They contacted more than 100 pet shops and suppliers before they were successful. They eventually contacted a company that kept computerized records of all customers, including those supplied by mail. One of those customers, John Taylor, lived in Bramley and had bought several dog collars similar to the one found on Leanne's body. It was impossible to ignore when the same name appeared from 2 separate lines of inquiry. John Taylor became the prime suspect. Upon further inquiries, police discovered that 44-year-old John Taylor was a Parcel Force employee and lived within a mile of where Leanne was abducted. Taylor was known locally as the Pet Man. He kept various animals at home, such as dogs and ferrets, and was a keen poacher. He was divorced with children. The fact that John Taylor worked at Parcel Force was also significant, as some of the cable ties found on Leanne's body were supplied almost exclusively to Parcel Force's parent company, Royal Mail. Police began searching Taylor's house with a fine-tooth comb. They found cable ties and a dog collar, identical to those found with Leanne's body inside Taylor's home. Police enlisted the help of forensic scientists to prove Leanne had been at Taylor's house. Scientists found a strand of pink carpet fiber on the jumper Leanne was wearing when she was found. Pink carpet fibers were then attached to a nail in Taylor's house. These fibers were indistinguishable from those found on Leanne's jumper. Taylor had destroyed the pink carpet, but luckily, a few fibers remained. After Taylor was arrested, forensic scientists also found Leanne's blood under Taylor's floorboards, and after excavating his garden, they found the remains of a small dog with a shattered skull. It's possible Taylor could have killed his dog. When police appealed for the news, with an e-fit of a man, saying that a man with a dog had been seen near the place and time where Leanne had gone missing. 10 months after Leanne disappeared, John Taylor was arrested and charged with her abduction and murder. Taylor pleaded guilty. When passing the sentence, the judge described the crime as cold and calculating an act as can be imagined. He told Taylor that he was a dangerous sexual sadist who should expect to spend the rest of his life in custody. Taylor was sentenced to 2 life sentences. In 2003, once police had Taylor's DNA profile on the database, Taylor was convicted of 2 rapes in 1988 and 1989 in the Bramley. The first rape in October 1988 occurred on Houghley Gill. the same public footpath from which Leanne was abducted. The second offense took place in March 1989, during which a young woman was attacked in her own home while alone with her 18-month-old daughter. Taylor pleaded guilty to these attacks and received 2 further life sentences. John Taylor was a man who was outwardly viewed as a regular guy, but who inwardly harbored darkness that led to murder. In 2000, Taylor abducted Leeds teenager, Leanne Tiernan, engendering a missing person search that became the biggest inquiry in the history of the West Yorkshire Police Force. Eventually convicted for her kidnap and murder, Taylor is currently serving 2 counts of life imprisonment. Leeds-born John Taylor enjoyed hunting from an early age. He was known to derive pleasure from inflicting pain on small animals. He would catch and torture rabbits. He had been seen stabbing a fox repeatedly while out poaching and also enjoyed clubbing pheasants to death. Taylor had problems with his relationships, although he had been married and had a son, born in 1981, and a daughter, born in 1983. He divorced Taylor as a parcel delivery worker and lived alone in his Paris home in Compilation, Bramley, Leeds. His neighbors thought him as trustworthy and described him as an ordinary bloke. However, under the surface, the troubled Taylor would advertise for female companions and would often travel across the country to have sex. On the evening of November 26, 2000, Leeds teenager Leanne Tiernan, 16, was on her way home when she disappeared. Studying for her GCSEs, Tiernan had been shopping for Christmas gifts in the city with her friend Sarah Whitehouse. The girls had shared a bus ride into the suburb of Bramley and parted near Whitehouse's home. Tiernan then continued alone towards her own home but never arrived. John Taylor had been lurking in the woods waiting for a likely victim. It turned out to be Tiernan. As she walked alone along the unlit path known as Houghley Gill, which she frequently used, Taylor grabbed her from behind. Whilst there were no eyewitnesses, it was later reported that someone had heard a stifled scream. Taylor put his hand over her mouth, blindfolded her, and led her to his house. There, he tied her hands behind her back and, during a sexual assault, strangled her with a scarf and a plastic ligature. Tiernan's parents, Michael Tiernan and Sharon Hawke, had divorced, and her father was on holiday then. When Tiernan did not return home from shopping, her mother immediately reported her missing to the police. She described her daughter as happy, confident, streetwise, and having never gone missing. Detective Superintendent Chris Gregg of the West Yorkshire Police led the investigation into Tiernan's missing person case. Investigators reconstructed Tiernan's last movements a week after her disappearance. On November 26th, her sister Michelle, 19, and friend Sarah Whitehouse, wearing the same clothing as Tiernan and Whitehouse, followed the same route home. Unfortunately, this did not produce any further clues. Tiernan's parents, both emotionally, appealed to the public for any assistance they may provide in the search for Leanne. There were several reports of possible sightings of Tiernan, which police investigated, but to no avail. The police search was complicated by the vastly varying terrain in the area where Tiernan had disappeared. There were more than 700 houses, open areas, woodland, canals, drainage shafts, and wells. Police conducted an extensive house-to-house inquiry, and the search eventually grew enormous, involving uniformed officers, operational support, the dog section, the mounted section, underwater search, and air support. On Monday, August 20th, 2001, 9 months after she disappeared, Leanne Tiernan's body was discovered near Otley on the border of North and West Yorkshire, 16 miles from her house and several miles from the scene of the crime. A man, out walking his dog in Lindley Woods near the Warren Point car park, stumbled across her body, wrapped in a floral duvet cover and buried in a shallow grave. It transpired that a few days before the body was discovered, a retired couple had seen a man carrying a large floral-patterned bundle from the boot of his car into the woods. Inside the duvet cover, Leanne's body was wrapped in green plastic, bin liners tied with twine. A black bin liner covered her head, held in place by a dog collar tied tightly around her neck. Her hands were bound together with cable ties, and around her neck were more cable ties and a scarf. The post-mortem examination concluded that the degree of decomposition of the body was inconsistent with burial in the ground for the whole 9 months since Tiernan's disappearance. Investigators were, therefore, hopeful that enough forensic evidence would be present to lead them to the killer. Police officers and forensic and scientific experts conducted a fingertip search of the dense woodland where Tiernan's body had been buried. They expanded this to cover an area of 20,000 square meters. Leanne Tiernan's funeral was held on Friday, September 28, 2001, a day after what would have been her 17th birthday. The service was held less than a mile from where she disappeared and close to her home, at the Sanford Methodist Church in Bramley. About 100 people packed into the small church where Tiernan had been baptized, whilst other mourners had to stand outside and hear a relayed version of the service led by Sister Janet Durbin. Deaconess Durbin said, "Leanne was a normal, happy, fun-loving teenager, half child and half young lady. Tiernan's mother, Sharon Hawkhead, her sister Michelle, her friend Sarah Whitehouse, and Detective Superintendent Chris Gregg were in attendance." The private burial took place at the nearby Hilltop Cemetery. During their investigation, the West Yorkshire police learned that Taylor had often been seen hunting small animals in Lindley Woods, where Tiernan's body was discovered, and he was placed on their list of suspects. Forensic investigators found dog hairs on Tiernan's body and needed further information. The dog hair DNA sample was sent to a university in Texas, which had developed a DNA profiling technique for pedigreed pets. The university produced a partial profile for a Doe, but unfortunately, the police were unable to link this to Taylor, as the dog he owned at the time of Tiernan's murder had subsequently died. This was the first time dog DNA had been used in a British criminal case. The knitted scarf found around Tiernan's neck contained human hair in the knot. Initial conventional DNA tests of the hair roots failed, so forensic experts used mitochondrial DNA testing. Using these results, they created a DNA profile from the minute amounts of DNA inside the hair shaft, which matched Taylor. John Taylor, 45, was arrested on October 16, 2001, and taken to a police station in Leeds for questioning. Police immediately sealed off his house in Cockshot Drive, putting up 7-foot-high wooden screens, and began their search. Investigators dug up the garden and discovered the bodies of 28 ferrets and the skeletons of 4 dogs, one with a crushed skull. Detective Superintendent Gregg commented, "Taylor appears to have been an ordinary man, but he is not. He has a dangerous, hazardous nature. This is displayed in how he treated animals throughout his life." Further investigation provided more evidence in their case against Taylor. A company in Nottingham had made the tan leather dog collar found on Tiernan's body. This company sold the collars to wholesalers, including a mail-order company in Liverpool, one of whose customers was Taylor. The twine used to tie the green bin liners around Tiernan's body was of an unusual composition. It was traced to a manufacturer in Devon, and, having originally been made for the Ministry of Defense, it had more recently been sold for rabbit netting. Later, in a search of Taylor's house, police found the exact length of the twine, as well as a piece of green plastic identical to the bin liners used to wrap Tiernan's dead body. The yellow cable ties used to bind and gag Tiernan had been manufactured by an Italian company that sold 99% of them to the Royal Mail. Taylor worked for Parcel Force, a division of Royal Mail. Red nylon fibers with distinctive dye patterns were discovered on Tiernan's jumper. These fibers matched those found clinging to nails in the floor of Taylor's house. He had previously ripped out and burned a red carpet to destroy evidence of Tiernan's presence in his home. Police investigators questioned Taylor's ex-girlfriends, who revealed similar stories of Taylor's love of tying up women, unusual fantasies, and enjoying sadomasochistic sex. One woman claimed Taylor had told her of his desire to have sex with her 15-year-old daughter. The West Yorkshire police knew Tiernan had not been Taylor's first victim. Gregg's team was further investigating other major crimes committed over the previous 20 years to see if Taylor may have been involved in them. They focused on 4 in particular. The first was the 1992 murder of Yvonne Fitt, a prostitute from Bradford, whose body was found in a shallow grave in the same woodland where Tiernan was buried. The other 3 were Lindsay Jo Reimer, who disappeared in 1994, Deborah Wood, whose body was found in 1996, and Rebecca Hall, found in an alley in Bradford in 2001. Taylor's 2002 trial was held at the Leeds Crown Court and presided over by the Honorable Mr. Justice Astill. Defense lawyer Graham Stowe Bateson represented Taylor, and despite the extensive evidence against him, Taylor only admitted to abducting Leanne and not killing her. His version of events was that she had fallen off his bed and banged her head. Believing she was dead, he had lifted her using the scarf that was around her neck, and that must have been when she died. He had panicked and buried her body in Lindley Woods. The results of the post-mortem examination of Tiernan's body concluded that the degree of decomposition was not consistent with burial in the ground for many months, as Taylor had suggested. The judge therefore concluded that the defendant had kept the body for some time between 3 weeks and 9 months in his deep freeze, perhaps as a trophy or to avoid detection, before burying it in the woods. Judge Astill said to Taylor, "You are a dangerous sexual sadist. Your purpose in kidnapping this young girl was so that you could satisfy your perverted cravings. This was a planned, premeditated encounter. It was a cold and calculating act, and the suffering you caused was immeasurable." Prosecutor Robert Smith QC claimed that the state of Tiernan's body when she was found meant that it wasn't possible to establish for sure whether or not she had been sexually abused. However, Smith claimed that Taylor's motive for killing her was clearly for sexual gratification. On July 8, 2002, showing no emotion, 46-year-old John Taylor pleaded guilty to the kidnapping and murder of Leanne Tiernan on November 26, 2000. Taylor stared straight ahead as he was sentenced to 2 counts of life imprisonment, during which the public gallery cheered and applauded. Judge Astill recommended that Taylor serve 25 years before being considered for parole. Lord Wolfe CJ later reduced this to 20 years, saying this was more in line with current practice. Taylor can most likely expect to spend the rest of his life in prison. Taylor was sent to the maximum security Wakefield prison, home to other infamous criminals, Harold Shipman, Ian Huntley, and Roy Whiting. Following sentencing, Tiernan's mother, Sharon Hawkhead, said, "Although John Taylor has been locked up, our agony continues. We feel nothing for him. We are pleased he has been locked up so he can't do this to anyone else. However, life should mean life." Police had warned that whilst Taylor had no criminal record before being charged with Tiernan's abduction and murder, he could feasibly have killed before. In the investigation following Taylor's arrest, police had embarked on a painstaking review of unsolved cases of sexual attacks in the area. By October 2002, Taylor was being questioned in connection with these 1980s assaults. The first occurred on October 18, 1988, when Taylor, armed with a mask and knife, attacked a 32-year-old woman as she walked across some wasteland near Houghley, Leeds. He forced her to commit a sexual act on him and then raped her. The second was on March 1, 1989, when a masked Taylor, armed with a knife, broke into a 21-year-old woman's Bramley home. It was lunchtime, and her baby was in another room. He forced her into her bedroom, undressed her, blindfolded and gagged her, forced her to perform a sexual act on him and then raped her. On April 3, 2003, Taylor pleaded guilty to the 2 rapes before the Honorable Norman Jones QC, the recorder of Leeds, who sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for a minimum of 30 years. The sentence would be reduced by 8 months and 26 days, which Taylor had already spent in prison. True North Productions made a television documentary about John Taylor, Killer in the Woods, 2003, produced and directed by Jess Fowle. I direct that under CPR PD 39A Para 61. No official shorthand note shall be taken of this judgment, and that copies of this version as handed down may be treated as authentic. Mr. Justice Openshaw. 1. On July 8, 200-2, following his plea of guilty to murder before Mr. Justice Astill at the Crown Court at Leeds, John Taylor was sentenced to the mandatory term of life imprisonment. The judge recommended that he serve 25 years before being considered for release by the parole board. In due course, Lord Wolfe CJ reduced that recommendation to 20 years. He said, no doubt correctly, that 25 years was out of line with current practice. However, before the Secretary of State set the minimum term he must serve, the process became subject to the new regime introduced by Section 269 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003. He is now an existing prisoner within the meaning of Schedule 22 of the Act. The Secretary of State has referred the matter to the High Court under paragraph 6 of that schedule for the minimum term to be set under Section 28(5) of the Crime Sentences Act, 1997. 2. Although I have read the police's report for the High Court, this summary of the facts is taken from the written recommendation made at the time by the sentencing judge. On the evening of November 26, 2000, Leanne Tiernan, a 16-year-old girl, was walking home along an unlit wooded path, known locally as Houghley Gill, in Leeds. The defendant, a stranger to her, was lying in wait. Leanne was not personally targeted. The defendant would have attacked any vulnerable young woman walking alone. There was no eyewitness to what followed, but a girl's scream was heard but stifled. It is plain that he seized her and, by force, compelled her to walk to his home, having tied her hands behind her back and blindfolded her. Back at his house during a sexual assault upon her, he strangled her with a scarf and a plastic ligature. 3. Leanne's body was not discovered until August 2001. It was buried in a shallow grave in Lindley Woods some miles away. A man had been seen carrying a large bundle from the boot of his car into the woods some days before the discovery. Her hands were tied, and a knotted scarf and a plastic cable were wound tightly around the neck. The post-mortem examination concluded that the degree of decomposition was inconsistent with burial in the ground for many months, as the defendant suggested. Based upon expert evidence, the judge concluded that the defendant had kept the body for some time in his deep freeze. Presumably, this was in part to avoid detection and in part as a trophy. 4. This was a planned and sadistic murder of a child, aggravated by a element of abduction and sexual assault. The victim must have suffered terribly. He then hid the body, first in the freezer, and then in the woods. Even in cases of this gravity, I am required to consider whether credit should be given for a plea of guilty. But some of the little credit available was lost by his persistence in denying some elements of the offense. A Newton hearing was ordered, but the defendant withdrew his basis of plea on the day of the hearing. These circumstances would now attract a whole life tariff, even on a plea. 5. I have read the representations made on his behalf by Graham Stowe Bateson. In my judgment, there was no mitigation whatsoever either in the facts of the offense or in his circumstances. He has made some progress in prison, but is set against the magnitude of his offending. This, frankly, counts for nothing. 6. I note that the victim's family has said they intend to submit the victim's personal statements, but they have not. Their anguish does not need to be spelled out, for it is obvious to all. 7. Following his arrest for murder and now having his DNA, the police embarked upon a painstaking review of the unsolved sexual attacks by strangers upon women in the locality. By this means, the defendant's guilt was proved of 2 other terrible rapes committed respectively in 1988 and 1989. The facts of these cases can be stated briefly. I use initials only to preserve their anonymity. A was aged 32. She was attacked and raped by the defendant, who was masked and armed with a knife, as she walked across some waste ground near Houghley Gill on October 18, 1988. He forced her to take his penis in her mouth. He raped her vaginally and threatened her with anal rape. Not surprisingly, she has been dreadfully affected by her ordeal. B was age 21 when she was accosted by a masked man armed with a knife, who intruded into her own home at lunchtime on March 1, 1989. He made her go to her bedroom, where he undressed her. He blindfolded her and gagged her. Again, he forced her to commit an act of oral sex upon him, ejaculating into her mouth. He then raped her vaginally and tried to rape her anally. She also still suffers from the after effects of the rape. In due course, the defendant pleaded guilty to these rapes before his honored Judge Norman Jones, QC, the recorder of Leeds, who sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment and expressly disapplied the early release provisions. This is, in effect, amounted to a whole life sentence. 8. The fact that this defendant now has a conviction for this murder and for these terrible rapes will be highly relevant if the parole board comes to consider the risk which he presents if he were ever to be released. In setting the minimum term, I am only concerned with the retributive and deterrent element. It is for the parole board, and not for me to consider the danger to the public. However, the question now arises whether I can and, if so, should, take the rapes into account when I now fix the time to be served by way of deterrence and retribution for the murder, or whether I must fix the minimum term, having regard only to those matters which were known to the trial judge at the time that he made his recommendation. There is, to my knowledge, no authority on the point. 9. By paragraph 10A of Schedule 22, the court may not set a minimum term, which in the opinion of the court is greater than that which, under the practice followed by the Secretary of State, before December 2002, the Secretary of State would have been likely to notify. This paragraph ensures that these provisions are not retrospective, for it would be objectionable if the Act exposed defendants to penalties more significant than the maximum sentence to which they were subject in law at the time of offending. I do not interpret this as preventing the court from taking into account the previous rapes, even though they came to light only after he was sentenced for the murder. Indeed, not to do so would be entirely contrary to common sense and public policy. Accordingly, I propose to do so as the trial judge and the Lord Chief Justice would have done had they known. 10. The guidelines then in force were those set by Lord Bingham CJ in his letter to the judges dated February 10, 1997, conveniently set out in paragraphs 449, 18, 21 of the Practice Direction of May 31, 2002, which set a starting point of 14 years for what he called the average murder. He identified the killing of a child, sexual maltreatment, and a substantial record of serious violence as aggravating features. All of these features are present here. What would the Secretary of State have set as the minimum term had he known of these matters? Until the passing of the 2003 Act, whole life terms were reserved for the very few notorious multiple offenders. I do not think that he would have imposed a whole life term. Accordingly, loyally applying the statute as I must, I cannot now impose an entire life term myself. However, even very long minimum terms were appropriate in those cases, such as the present, where there are several different aggravating factors. This is undoubtedly one of those most serious cases where the Secretary of State would have gone as high as 30 years, even on a plea. Accordingly, I set the minimum term at 30 years. 11. I order, as I am required to do, that the term of 30 years is reduced by the 8 months and 26 days he spent in custody before being sentenced. 12. I am anxious that this sentence is not misunderstood or misreported. The sentence is and remains a sentence of imprisonment for life. The defendant may not even be considered for release for this offense of murder until he has served at least 30 years. That is not to say that he will then be released, for the whole life term imposed for the rapes remains in force. Furthermore, the defendant will be detained until the parole board is satisfied that he no longer presents a risk to the public. Many prisoners, and surely John Taylor is likely to be one, are detained for many years after their tariff has expired. Indeed, he may present such a risk that he could never safely be released, but that is for others to decide in due course. I am just anxious that no one thinks that I am suggesting that he be released in 30 years, for I most certainly am not.